Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you? Good morning.
Good morning, Frank. How are you?
Well, thank you.
This week I've been, partly because I've been reading student papers all the week, and some of them have written about this sort of thing. I have social media on my mind. Of course, this is going to bring up a number of things we've talked about before, but I think it provides much more detail than we've had in our previous discussions of this sort of thing. I mean, social media have only been with us for not much more than a decade, but the way they're being used and the effects they have on everything else and the process of globalization, I think, keeps developing. And it means that whatever happens in society now, there are more ways of participating in it. And as we've said before, one of the big problems in globalization is that all the different ways we've had of organizing things in the past, including our ideal forms of democratic government, are being changed in ways that we don't really understand until they've had effects that we weren't ready for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are two things that I need to mention to begin with that obviously are related to social media and probably caused things to happen that couldn't have happened without social media. And one is the so-called Arab Spring
Yes.
of 2010-11, which we're still we're still living with the effects of it, and it led in many ways, in some countries at any rate, in Syria to civil war, which is
Ongoing.
no idea how to bring it to an end. And in fact, the way we're dealing with it seems to be causing it to get worse rather than better. And then the other extreme is Egypt, which led to the reimposition of a really authoritarian and repressive regime. So that's one end of it, and that started not quite a decade ago, but it's getting on for that.
Almost.
But the other thing is, of course, what is being investigated in this country is the way social media globally can affect what's going on in a democratic election locally.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still waiting to see what the investigation of the possible interference in the 2016 election in this country, how that might have worked. But I think that it's becoming more clearer and clearer that there were a number of people in different parts of the world, though Russia seems to get the main blame for it, but I think it wasn't only Russia, that were influencing people in this country through social media. So the question, of course, is how up until before the development of social media, just over a decade ago, this sort of thing was just not possible. And it's difficult to see from now on how any decisions that need to be made for the local, for the good of the local population in any country, can actually be carried out without interference from other parts of the world. And obviously, nobody's going to bother to try to interfere with what's going on in some countries. It's only particular countries that have some sort of international role that are going to be affected by this. And it's going to be interesting to see what they do about it. And of course, China it is the only country that has so far worked out ways to control social media, and but whether they, in fact, whether the regime there, whether the government there will be able to completely control social media, I'm not sure. But I imagine that if they couldn't, they'd just make the whole thing illegal and get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd probably be able to do that, but we couldn't do that here. So I suppose we need to have 2020 in mind and be ready for what might happen then.
These are good observations, certainly, and I'm reminded as you're speaking, between official government propaganda coming from Radio Moscow or Radio Beijing back in the 1950s and 60s, through influence attempts throughout Europe by the communist government, the then communist government in Moscow, and then of course in the non-governmental sector, the effectivity of advertising in the United States and in the West in terms of influencing people's opinions in terms of product selection or even political preferences. I mean, this is as old as the hills, so to speak, this attempt to try to use whatever media is in existence to try to influence people. Obviously, the rise of social media is something completely new, completely different, completely unforeseen 10, 15, 20 years ago. And people haven't caught up with it yet.
It's amazing how long it's taking for there to be serious studies of it.
I agree.
I wonder why nobody has suggested investigating the relationship between the use of social media and the referendum in England in 2016. I mean,
let me ask you a question. I agree with that, and the social media was a huge effect on the Brexit vote. There's no doubt about that. And I think that layer of the onion is yet to have been completely peeled away. But when they do, I think they're going to find the Russians behind it, supporting Nigel Farage and the exit. But let me ask you this. I mean, the British MI6 is positively diabolical in its approach to the world. The CIA is no shrinking violet either. Do you think that the West is making very effective use of social media as well, perhaps aiming it at, to the extent that it can, getting behind the Great Wall of China, the digital wall of China, and getting into Russia? I mean, certainly there are efforts going on here that are directed toward those groups.
Well, that's an interesting idea, and I hadn't thought of that. But I would have thought if there had been anything like that going on, there would have been some sort of publicity about it in other parts of the world, and that they would get reported here.
Yes, if they had been discovered. And when you look at the Arab Spring, I understand the desire to maintain the status quo and the balance of power and everything, but I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere way back there, when everything is, if it ever is exposed, they're going to find an unseen hand, as they say, that helped spark some of this and certainly coaxed it along. I don't know. I only say that because you always read these stories about how the capabilities available to the American president are such that he or she could order the lights turned off in Moscow for an hour on New Year's Eve. All right, and if that kind of power exists, certainly it would seem to me that they'd be able to have an influence campaign on Facebook or Twitter or something. I don't know, but I do think that within a period of time, whatever that is, 5 years or 10 years, people are going to have caught up with this, and people who are millennials now, who are 20 years old or so, when they're 30 years old, are really going to be able to pick their way through what's truthful and not truthful on social media. And their way of understanding the world will have adapted based on that input tool that they've been using since the beginning of their memory.
Yeah. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to contribute to this discussion. One is that, of course, we have, for the first time, and the first time in the world, I think, we have our current president is very active on one form of social media.
Yes.
And so what he's saying is being followed all over the world, which probably would attract people in other parts of the world to, what should I say, react also on social media, which could rebound onto the American system. And then the other thing that I wanted to say that might be related to this is that we've said before that the problem with political decisions recently has been that the final result of elections tends to have been decided by a different part of the society than would have decided it before. That is, the way people make up their minds to vote is the way the dynamics of political decision making works is different now. So when I was growing up, I got the impression that people decided who to vote for in a perfectly democratic country. This was England at the time. Was determined by the more informed members of the society who were making it known what they thought would be best. And now what is happening is people who are not informed and know much less about what they're making decisions about are making up their own minds based on the way they understand things, but their understanding is imperfect. And that has been happening on a local level, and it's now beginning to happen on an international level.
So that's true. I mean, remember how important in the political process the obtaining of endorsements was?
Yes.
From political figures or even non-political figures, because they were thought to be able to sway people's opinions. Correct. You're right. But that's not so important anymore.
Yes. And so when we have one person who we talk about a lot, who's always talking about their political base. Their political base is in the uninformed part of society.
Yes. Yes. And it's very interesting because it's an unusual situation. One of the papers, I forget which it was, maybe it was the Washington Post, had an article this week about the effects of the current administration's policies. And they looked at the EPA, they looked at the healthcare law, they looked at the education rollbacks, and there were a couple of other metrics they used, and they did this in the context of a map of the United States. And of course, as you could predict, the impacts of the administration's actions are most severely felt in states that are commonly thought to be where the base, quote unquote, of the president lives, the rural areas in the center and the South. And you almost want to make a point loudly. It's like, wait a minute, don't you understand? While you're supporting this person, his policies may not necessarily be what you want. And that kind of understanding hasn't been reached yet. And in a political discourse that hopefully we're going to see in the next 2 years here, I think that's going to be the biggest discussion point. And whether or not we're going to be able to have that discussion in a civil manner where facts can be exchanged, or whether it's going to devolve into this tribalism that we've seen, that's going to be very difficult to see anything happening other than this kind of bomb throwing at each other. It's not a healthy situation.
No, well, this is not a very optimistic way to end our.
Oh no, I'm actually very optimistic. I'm very optimistic. I think that in time things resolve themselves, and I think there's a sense that after a while it's like that old TV commercial. Where's the beef? Where's the beef? I mean, people, even if you're in that base of the 35%, ultimately are going to say, where's the beef? And it's if it's there, it's there. I don't know, but if it's not going to be there, then that's going to be a different story. So
I think 2019 is going to be an interesting year.
it's not going to be as interesting as 2020, but it will be an interesting year. Yes.
But 2019 is going to be the lead up to 2020.
This is true. Nobody can accuse the two of us of not knowing math. So, all right,
Okay.
well, Professor, thank you. I guess I'll see you next year.
Yes, yes.
All right. Well,
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you.